Imagine inheriting the most powerful empire in the world when you're barely old enough to shave. You're surrounded by wealth beyond comprehension, legions ready to march at your command, and a populace that either worships you or fears you. Now imagine that the only detailed stories we have about your life were written decades after your death, by your sworn political enemies. They accused you of setting fire to your own capital, of castrating a young boy so you could marry him as a wife, of kicking your pregnant spouse to death in a fit of rage, and of massacring an entire religious sect as scapegoats for your own failings. This isn't the plot of a modern horror movie. This is the curated history of Emperor Nero. But what if the darkest secrets that Roman historians tried to bury weren't about what Nero did, but about why they lied to us for 2,000 years? Today, we are bypassing the ancient propaganda machine to uncover the secrets the Senate tried to erase from memory. This is the untold story of Nero's darkest secrets. First, we have to address the most iconic image of Roman villainy, the Great Fire of 64 AD. We've all heard the phrase, fiddling while Rome burned. According to the narrative pushed by the historian Suetonius and the elite Senate, Nero stood on his balcony, strumming a lyre and singing about the fall of Troy as the city below him turned to ash. Suetonius even claimed that Nero wanted to burn down the parts of the city he disliked just so he could build his own extravagant palace in their place. But that's where the first major lie collapses. We know with absolute certainty that Nero was not in Rome when the fire started. Tacitus, our most reliable ancient source on this, documented that Nero was over 35 miles away at his villa in Antium. The fiddle itself didn't even exist. It wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. But here's where the secret gets buried. According to Tacitus, when Nero heard the news, he immediately returned to the city. He didn't play an instrument. He opened his own gardens to the homeless. He brought in emergency food supplies to prevent mass starvation. And he even lowered the price of grain to avoid a famine. So why do we think he was an arsonist? Because Nero used the devastation to build something spectacular. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It was a palace so vast that it covered hundreds of acres and featured an artificial lake, a revolving dining room, and walls encrusted with gold and gems. It was a flex of absolute power that terrified the aristocracy. They couldn't destroy the narrative that he was a competent administrator, so they destroyed the narrative that he was sane. But the fire was just the backdrop for an even darker chapter that Roman historians tried to bury in half-truths: the persecution of the Christians. Tacitus writes that to stop the rumors that he had started the fire himself, Nero scapegoated a new and mischievous superstition. The punishment was brutal. Christians were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs, doused in tar, and set on fire as human torches to light his gardens. This has cemented Nero in Christian tradition as the Antichrist and the first great persecutor. However, here is the secret that historians like Brent Shaw have unearthed. The term Christian likely didn't even exist in Rome in 64 AD. The earliest followers of Jesus were Jews, and Paul himself never used the word Christian. The accounts of this specific grotesque execution come from Tacitus writing over 50 years after the event, drawing from a senatorial class that needed to prove how un-Roman Nero was. Was there a violent crackdown on a foreign cult? Probably. But the specific details of the torchlit gardens might very well be a piece of early fake news. A vivid, memorable horror story designed to bury any remaining sympathy for the dead emperor. Now, let's strip away the politics and get to the personal depravity that even the most revisionist historians can't excuse. The secrets that are likely true, and perhaps even darker than we can imagine. We're talking about a series of family murders that make the show Succession look like a polite boardroom meeting. And it starts with his own mother, Agrippina. Agrippina was a ruthless, power-crazed woman who had schemed to put her son on the throne. She seduced her own uncle, Emperor Claudius, and had him adopt Nero. Then, she poisoned Claudius with a dish of poisoned mushrooms so her son could take power. But as Nero grew up, he found his mother's grip suffocating. The Roman historians tell us that Nero decided to kill her. But he didn't just use a sword or poison, he built a self-destructing boat. The plan was for the ceiling of her cabin to collapse and crush her, or for the ship to sink far out at sea. It was a diabolical, cartoonishly evil scheme that perfectly fits the image of a mad emperor. And the darkest part? It didn't work. Agrippina swam to shore. When Nero found out his mother had survived his engineered accident, he sent a team of assassins to finish the job. Her last words, reportedly, were, "Strike my womb," the womb that had given birth to such a monster. But the blood didn't stop there. Before killing his mother, he had already poisoned his stepbrother Britannicus during a dinner party, right in front of the other guests. He watched as the boy convulsed and died, telling everyone it was just an epileptic fit. And then there are the wives. He divorced his first wife, Octavia, had her exiled to an island, and then had her suffocated in a steam bath. Her head was brought back to Rome as a trophy for his second wife, Poppaea. And what about Poppaea, the great love of his life? According to Suetonius, she made the mistake of nagging Nero about how much time he spent at the races. So, while she was pregnant with his child, Nero kicked her in the abdomen, killing both her and his unborn heir. He was so grieved by this, or perhaps so guilty, that he then found a young boy named Sporus who looked just like her. Nero had Sporus castrated, dressed him in the empress's clothes, and married him in a full public ceremony. He called him Sabina and paraded him around as his wife. And if that wasn't confusing enough, Nero also married a freed slave named Pythagoras. But in that relationship, Nero dressed as the bride. The man who ruled the world wanted to be the blushing bride at his own wedding. In the end, the Senate and the Praetorian Guard turned on him. The man who had been proclaimed emperor as a teenager was declared a public enemy. As the troops closed in to arrest him and execute him, likely by flogging or crucifixion, Nero fled to a villa just outside Rome. He was terrified of pain and death. His companions begged him to fall on his sword to preserve what little dignity he had left. He ordered them to dig a grave for him, constantly muttering the words, "Qualis artifex perio," what an artist dies in me. He couldn't do it himself. As the horses of the approaching soldiers thundered in the distance, he forced his private secretary, Epaphroditus, to guide his hand as he drove a dagger into his throat. He was 30 years old. After his death, the Senate tried to erase him. They passed a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. They smashed his statues, recarved his face into images of his successors, and buried his golden palace under a mountain of landfill so that no one could see the magnificence he had created. They wanted to bury his secrets. But here's the final twist. They buried his legacy under so much dirt, so much political slander, that we're still digging it up 2,000 years later. So, was Nero the Antichrist fiddling in a sea of flames, or was he a flawed artist who became the scapegoat for an empire's decline? The truth, like the hidden Sphinx room just uncovered under his palace, is still waiting in the dark. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more of the truth behind history's greatest villains, make sure to like this video and subscribe. See you in the next one.